Whenever this reading comes along in the Gospel about Mary and Martha, I have two simultaneous reactions which would qualify that I feel ambivalent. Now, the first reaction I have is very happy. I'm always happy when this reading comes around because I see it as a very powerful and empowering reading for women, very specifically, and an important challenge to the church in every generation from the moment that Jesus did this thing that we're going to talk about. The second reaction that I have is also almost this frozen moment where I'm kind of looking at it going, what am I going to say and how will I say it? Because the way I say it in this body makes an incarnational difference, doesn't it? I have male clergy friends who get up and talk about this reading when they're talking about the role of women and the important women in their lives, their mothers, their wives, their sisters. They have the experience of everybody sitting out there loving them. Loving that they love their mothers and their wives and their sisters. They love them, that man up there saying that. I get up in this body and I talk about women and empowerment of women. And women are awesome. And women are going to change the world. And I get people going, oh, there she goes again. Oh, she's that F word, a feminist. Right there. Right there. I know some people are thinking it. Right? Because when I talk about wonderful women, women's empowerment, that's very different from when a guy stands up and says that. Why is that? That's a problem in itself. That's our problem in itself, and we need to realize that. Why is it even men and women receive better these messages of women's empowerment when it comes from a man with the authority to say that? And isn't he wonderful that he loves women? Got it. We're in the middle, seriously. That's why I have a lot of anxiety sometimes when I get up and talk about it, because I know I'm going to shake the bag a little bit, whatever's in there. Now, the first thing, the reason I'm really happy about it and see it as a genuinely, today we would call it feminist thing, is because of what Jesus is doing in this moment, and it's very important to understand the context. The context is, go back to that Old Testament reading we just heard about Sarah and Abraham. Sarah and Abraham come from a tradition of radical hospitality to the desert people. It's considered a virtue to be hospitable to those who are traveling in the wilderness of the desert. A lot of reasons for that. Obviously, you want people to have that as a value so that you don't die and starve in the desert, right? So that when you're traveling across it, if you get in trouble, you know that you can receive welcome in someone's home. I lived in Alaska for about 3 years in a cabin with no running water. It was exactly the same. If someone was in trouble and they needed a place to shelter from the wind or the cold, or they ran out of heating fuel in their own cabin, we knew that we could go to one another. And in Fairbanks, where I live, we kept the cabin doors unlocked. In case someone needed something, they could come in and borrow that thing. And it's this sense of course I'm going to be hospitable to your need. And so Sarah and Abraham are really living out of that. So when these apparently divine visitors of three come together and visit Abraham, he is extremely excited. He's very honored. And there's this Old Testament belief in the tradition that you should be good and kind, and people visit you lest angels visit you and you're not aware of it. You never know who it is that you're really helping sometimes, do you? So he right away wants to be hospitable. And how does he do that? Right, get to work. Did you notice that? He even goes in and tells her what recipe to use. Now, I'm hearing that with the heritage of an American woman who's aware that my women ancestors fought for 87 years to even just get a freaking vote in this country. And those battles are not over, unfortunately, because we still have to sit up there in Congress and say, please give us equal wage. We're still doing this stuff, right? So I'm hearing this through my filter. And basically, Abraham comes in and says to Sarah, I want to use this recipe, you're going to do this word, and he's bossing everybody around. and telling the servants what to do, and basically his wife is another servant because she was. In that culture, she was his property, having formerly been the property of her father, and having no rights without the representation of a male in her family. All right? So that's very real. That's part of what happens here. It's interesting that at the end of it, the 3 guests even asked about her at all. So that's an important thing. Hey, where's your wife? You know, well, she's in the tent where she's supposed to be. You know, working, doing stuff, making sure. I'm the host. I'm the one that gets all the good juju. I'm going to come out and say hello to you. And, well, we're going to give her a blessing too, because somehow they recognize her hospitality. And then she says they don't have this line, but when they tell Abraham, well, she's going to have a baby, you're going to get back, I'm going to give you news that she's going to have a baby, her reaction to that is to laugh. Right? But somehow they are recognizing her role in that. Now here's where Jesus goes like 1,000 steps farther than that. In the time in which Jesus is alive and teaching, the culture there is, again, in the Roman Empire. It didn't matter whether you look at this from a Hebrew perspective or a Roman Empire perspective. Women, again, are still being considered not even citizens of the empire. Women were not citizens. There were, at least in the occupied areas where they were, some women could have a lot of say, but only if they were Roman women. In the occupation where they are, in this territory, not only are they not seen as citizens, only certain Roman men are, not even all the conquered men, etc. and so forth. So women are way down on this pole, and in the Hebrew tradition, they certainly are not being trained to be rabbis, and they're not being trained to have any role within the temple in a priestly capacity. That is simply not open to their gender. So here comes Jesus, and if you remember, the context is he has just come up through the Wadi Kelt from Jericho with his followers on their pilgrimage to Jerusalem to attend the Passover for the last time. This is his final journey to Jerusalem. And when they come out of the Wadi Kelt, they get to this town, Bethany, where Jesus has some women friends. Time and time again in our gospel stories, we have the examples of the way that women were lifted up to leadership by Jesus. We have names like Lydia that are given to us in the letters and in the Acts of the Apostles that show us that women were responsible for home churches and that they presided at the rites of remembrance. We have that evidence. And yet, when I was in Catholics, I was a Catholic before I was a Episcopalian. I went to a Catholic seminary. And when I was discerning about what to do with my life, I remember having a conversation with a Catholic priest who was actually a very good friend of mine. And he said, you know, I've been thinking, the Archbishop keeps sending out little letters about how the priests are supposed to submit names for ordination. And I'm really tempted to send your name in. I said, well, you get in massive trouble with your Archbishop when you do that. And he goes, I don't know. I said, well, why do you think that it is that the church does not want, this is many, many years ago, why do you think the church doesn't want to ordain women? And he got really quiet, and he said, when I talk to my colleagues, the number one reason I get is that they're afraid that by women joining the clergy, that the prestige of the position will be diminished. Really? This is a heck of a lot more about what y'all think the priesthood is than what I think it is. There's no reflection on me. So as I was kind of pondering that, eventually after I went to seminary and then made the determination to become an Episcopal person, Nigel, my husband, and I had the opportunity to go for the very first time to Israel on his first sabbatical. And we had a very nice guy who was an Arab Christian guy the whole time, a really great guy, it was tremendously knowledgeable. And at one point, I'm being my happy American woman self. I'm just, you know me, right? I'm just kind of going, oh, this is great, I love being here, this is awesome. I'm not changing who I am because of the context of where we are. We're hiking down the Wadi Kelt, as I kind of mentioned last week. And having a great time. At the end of that, we went into a shrine area. And this very nice guy, when I was away from where Nigel was, I went into a shrine by myself, and he immediately followed me in there and put his arm around me and put me really close. Women, what does that mean? What? Control. What else does it mean? Protection. And if he leans his head towards me, he goes, what does that mean? That's bad. Power, control, because he can, because he got me isolated, because I was being friendly, and in his culture, what did that mean? I'm a loose woman, and I'm looking for you, right? That's how he's allowed to interpret that in his culture, right? And at least he's kind of taking advantage of what his culture said he can do. That's not unique to their culture, people. That happens every day here, every day here. But I use it in that context because I turned around and I looked at him and I said, it would be so helpful to both you and I if you just thought about me as a man. And he let go and go, what? Are you a man? It's like horrified. And I said, how would you behave with another man who was a friend who wanted to be your friend? And he said, well, we would just go do stuff together, have a drink, and da-da-da. I said, well, let's do that. But don't do this. Because you just created a relationship which is top down because that's what you're comfortable with. You can't even imagine being on an equal plane. Why would you do that? What's the hardship there? And again, a part of me was the anthropologist part of me was saying, well, I am in his country, I am in his place, but that didn't mean I'm giving up all my rights from the women in my culture and history. It did not mean for a moment that I'm willing to give up my identity and background and heritage at all. But these questions become extremely relevant in every intercultural engagement we have, and it's playing itself out on the national level today, isn't it? But when Jesus is with Martha and Mary, they are very much living out of that kind of expectation of what women should be and what they're supposed to do for the men in their culture. And the men in their culture are very much considered people of power. Which is why Martha goes out to Jesus as the only guy in the home, not sure where Lazarus was. But Martha goes over and says, you make her do this. Well, there's must be some triangulation. Instead of actually going up to her sister and saying, I have a problem with you doing this. And she's obviously sitting right there. So she's feet away, she's at his feet. And yet she doesn't go over to him, she goes over to Jesus and says, Jesus, make her get up and Martha. And she's sitting right there. Well, I love what Jesus does because he doesn't want to get triangulated. He rejects that. Because what he's really all about is people owning their own power, their own authority. And everybody has it, but everyone's responsible for it. Everyone has our own power, we have our own authority that is God-given, and we are all responsible for it. Not only for how we act out of our personal authority, but how we oppress others with it, or ask them to collaborate with what might be a very dysfunctional use of our authority. Because it is not about power, says Jesus. It is about authority, and those are two different things. We're operating out of power when we feel a need to subjugate somebody else or put someone down so that we feel up. But we're operating out of authority when we do as Jesus did with Martha and Mary. And say, look, you're very worried and you're doing your own thing and you seem quite uncomfortable with the idea that she's operating out of her social norms. You're very worried about that because you recognize that what Jesus is doing, teaching Mary as a student, treating her like a man. Because what he's doing there is using the typology of this tradition. The way that students in the Hebrew tradition were elevated to become warriors or become scholars in the Torah, to become priests, they were taught quite literally at the feet of a teacher. And that was the formation, long before there's universities or anything else. And the fact that he allows her to take that position as student and he steps into the role of teacher, they are both doing something very dangerous, and Martha knows it. They're doing something very countercultural and very new and very different, and it's very worrisome. We know in psychology that people who are used to being victimized or are used to being abused or used to being oppressed will often have a terrible struggle when they're asked to operate out of their own sense of self, their own authority and autonomy. It's a huge challenge to get out of whatever programming that you have. That's huge for women, it's huge for minorities, it's huge for children. Part of going from childhood and adolescence to becoming an adult is you're trying to figure out, how do I move from a place where it was very appropriate that other people told me a lot of what I should be doing, to a place where I'm taking responsibility for what I'm doing. I'm owning my adulthood, but that comes with a lot of responsibility. Whenever we are working toward our freedoms or toward our God-given gifts, that is truly something that being empowered calls us to also be, if there's just such a word, and responsible. We are also asked to take responsibility. And I think it's a responsibility that Martha doesn't want. She's much more comfortable in the traditional role that she has because that's where she sees the value of hospitality being lived out. But what Jesus, I think, is saying with Mary is he's actually doing something very hospitable to her. He is acknowledging who she is more fully than probably anyone in her culture has ever done. Recognizing her as a woman of some intelligence, recognizing her as an equal of human, recognizing her as someone who is deserving of respect and regard. These are tough changes to make. Now, on my end, another story I'll share. In the days when I was in graduate school at Indiana University, now the Lathams will remember Bloomington, Indiana, a very diverse place in the midst of Indiana. Now, no one thinks of Indiana as being the hotbed of liberalism, not even today, right? But Bloomington, Indiana, has the influence of the Indiana University. It was extremely diverse. And I worked in an Ethiopian restaurant to help pay my bills going through graduate school. And one night, as I'm serving tables, in comes a fellow, and he says, "Hi, I'm here visiting, and my family is visiting, and we're here for a wedding, but we have a lot of people here. We've had the wedding, but now we want to come in and have some dinner." I said, "Okay." And then he said, "And the women have to have their own tables, and do not give them menus. And the men will have all the menus, and they will sit in separate tables." I said, "Do you have to be in separate rooms?" He said, "No, we just have to be apart." Okay. So I get this all set up, and I'm going, my anthropology part is going, well, this will be really interesting. And the woman part of me is going, what? And I'm having both reactions simultaneously. I want to be respectful to the difference. I don't want to impose my own expectation. But the American woman in me who has a whole lifetime is going, what? All right. So I get it all set arranged that they want. And as things are going along, the guy who's kind of the host of this party, it is obvious to me that I am in the servant role. That's right, I'm the waitress. But I am really in the servant role. And at one point, he says to me, "My Coca-Cola is too fizzy." Want me to pick you up and burp you? What's this about? But the anthropologist says, "Are you not used to carbonated beverages?" And he said, "Yes, I drink them all the time, but this one is too fizzy." I said, "Would you like another drink?" "Yes, bring me some iced tea." And the whole time I'm going back to the kitchen, I'm going, anyway, I'm out with his iced tea. And I started I recognized that I'm really not welcome other than to bring stuff to the men's table. So I'm hanging out with the women on this one. Right? And I'm doing everything I can. I'm admiring their babies that they have with them. The guys take whatever food they want, and they give me the leftovers on the platter and take over to the women. But that's how it's done. And they believe that they're being very hospitable to the women because they're giving them some choice bits. I give my puppy choice bits. So the whole thing, I was having this kind of double vision the whole time along, right? And then, in the same time, I don't know if it walks in the world that way, but more and more, as we are encountering what's going on in our world today, it really is sort of a Mary and Martha story on a global level. And here's why I think that. I think we have many communities in our nation and in the world that are basically asking those people who've been used to living in privilege, from whatever status that is, the Western culture, the male culture, the white culture, however we phrase that, it takes different expression. Whatever that, whoever's carrying that privilege is currently being challenged locally, domestically, internationally, to understand that they have that privilege. And women in our country and in other countries, girl children, a lot of you stop see, are saying we need to be educated. Women and girl children should be educated. They should have that right. And then we have others saying women should be paid the same for the same work. And we have others saying it doesn't matter what minority woman you are, you should be able to have equal access to health care. And we have people saying it doesn't matter what economic bracket you're in. All women everywhere should be able to have safety from abuse on the streets where they walk. Those are fairly basic things. And the way that it's also being acted out with other kinds of Marys. We have Marys who we see in immigrants who are basically looking for the same kind of opportunities that Europeans looked for 200 plus years ago. Opportunities to have a safe life, opportunities to make a living and have dignity in making that living, to provide for their families, to have religious freedom and expression, to act differently, even to be independent, for women to be able to drive her son is huge. And then we have the trauma that I see we continue sometimes to react from as a country instead of be proactive about responding to. Our trauma as a country goes back for us at least to 9/11, and our world has become a world where we continue to see terrorism and terrorists everywhere we look. And it's not the right interpretation, but we're seeing it through that particular experience. Whether it was in Dallas, Texas a couple weeks ago, or even in Nice, France the other day, the first reaction was, it's terrorists and terrorism. Upon investigation, what we learn is, it's mental health. It's mental health. And the messages going on around in culture where the fear and anxiety are is exactly where mental health folk are going to latch. Where's the fear and anxiety? It's in terrorists and terrorism, folks that look like me. I'm the scapegoat now. And yet, what we have to remember about history in Europe is the very first country that the Nazis took over was their own. The very first country they took over was their own. And the reason that's important is I compare it to ISIS. The very first and greatest victims constantly in Baghdad are Muslim people. ISIS has first victimized their own, and Muslims are not equatable to ISIS. We may have differences about what we believe. We may have differences about how men and women should be. I, for my own part, will always work towards equality for women because that's part of my body. That's part of my history. But I will not approve oppressing someone else if they choose to live that way else. And notice how even while Jesus is trying to lift up Mary, he is not necessarily telling Martha, your way of being is wrong. But he is saying it's a good part, but there's a better part. There's a part which asks you to take responsibility for who you are and your impact. Take responsibility for the gifts that God has given you. Take responsibility when God calls you to come out of the secure places that keep you hidden and frightened. Come out of those places. Break through whatever lenses you have on, whatever box box you've helped put yourself in or others would have you stay in, and move forward into a future that asks each and every one of us in creating the kingdom of God to be well and truly free. Because the greatest and first bonds that we all have to break are the ones in the kingdom. In Christ's name.